Hello, and welcome to Mission Possible, How to Start and Grow a Nonprofit. I'm Tanya Winders, the president of the Global Allergy and Airways Patient Platform, and we're excited that you've chosen to join us today for this important webinar. Our time together today, I really only have two key learning objectives. First, to give you the confidence, conviction, and keys to start, run, and grow a thriving nonprofit. And secondly, to identify some credible sources that you can go to for additional support and information after today's webinar. So when you're thinking about starting a nonprofit or continuing to grow your nonprofit, I also think it's important to start with why. If you're not familiar with Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, I would encourage everyone to go out and get a copy and read it. It's a phenomenal book of how great leaders inspire others to take action. And always remembering it's not the what that you're doing, but the why that you're doing it is really the heart of having a successful nonprofit and really a successful business, whether it's on the for-profit or nonprofit side. So what is a nonprofit? It is a legal structure. Oftentimes it requires filing registration papers. It also requires having bylaws and a board of directors. And so it is often recognized fully by either your local, state, or federal, national government entity. It also is a mission-driven organization. It has an overall mission and purpose. Why you do, what you do, for whom do you do it, and how do you do it. All of those things are integral into developing a strong mission and purpose for your organization. It's also an organization that has a business model and a funding plan, and we're going to talk more about that as we go along. A nonprofit is also vital to have a strong team. It cannot be done by one person alone. So that may be when you're in the startup phase or that grassroots phase that you can do this all by yourself. But to be honest, as a nonprofit grows, you can't do it alone. You have to build a strong team around you. So we'll spend a good bit of time talking more about that. And then once you build that strong team, once you have that business model and funding plan in place, it's how do you measure impact? How do you know that you're achieving the mission and the purpose and fulfilling the goals that you set forth? And then we'll wrap up our time by talking about a few of the nonprofit myths that exist out there and how to address those myths and misperceptions. And then finally, follow up with a conversation around the nonprofit life cycle and where you are today versus where you want to be tomorrow and in the future. So let's say we've got our legal status in place. We're a recognized nonprofit in our country, and then we've got our mission and our purpose in place. We know who we are and what we want to accomplish overall. So then it comes down to how to create that business model. Who are the key partners, activities, and resources that we need to deliver our mission? What are those programs and who are they going to benefit? What are the beneficiary relationships or segments of the population that we can serve? And then how are we going to get to them? What are the distribution channels that we can activate to ensure that we're getting our mission offerings, our programs to the right people? And then how much is it going to cost? And what is the impact going to be? So this is how I approach anytime we've got a new consideration about a new project, a new program, and how it feeds into the mission of the overall organization. Next, as we've talked about before in previous webinars, money makes the world go round. We have to have funding and resources in order to fulfill our mission. So in doing that, it's important to build what I call a case for support. We have to know our mission, which is why we exist, and our vision. What is the desired future state that this program, this project, and our organization can fulfill? Secondly, what are our goals and objectives? What do we want to accomplish, and how do we plan to do that? These need to be spelled out explicitly on paper every time that you go to seek funding for a new project. Next, what is our proven history in this area? How long have we been doing this? What does our past experience tell us? And how well have we done this in the past? If you build on your strengths and your past successes, then it's much more likely than you're going to get funded for future projects. And then budget. How much is it going to take? Where is that going to come from? Are there a variety of sources that you can go to, whether that be individual donors or corporate donors, foundations, federal or state government type of grants that are out there? How can you get the funding needed to carry those projects and that mission forward? And then the structure. Who's going to do what? You have to have a plan in place for how to actually carry out the work. And if you can build this into a concise case for support, then more times than not, it'll lead to securing the funding needed to move that project forward. But the truth is, you have to do your homework. You must do your research up front. It has to be a program or a mission objective that meets unmet needs. You can't be a me too. You have to add something new to the space and really contribute in an innovative and exciting way. Secondly, how big is the need? How many people can you impact? How far can you reach? Where are those individuals? How and where do you need to go about delivering those programs and resources? And then who else is addressing this? Are there others in the space that are already actively addressing that unmet need? Are there ways to partner or to work alongside them and to complement what they're doing rather than be redundant? And then who will fund this effort? Again, thinking about diversifying your revenue streams and really being creative in where we seek funding for the work that we want to do is a critical aspect to not only starting a nonprofit, but continuing to grow it year over year. And then who is willing and able to help? Oftentimes I think that when you're starting a nonprofit, you got plenty of people around you who have the passion and the heart and the desire, but they simply may not have the ability or the time needed to volunteer, to step in, and to get things off the ground. So knowing wherever you are in that nonprofit life cycle, but especially at that grassroots startup phase, who is willing to help and how they can actually help is vital to carrying that forward. And then what data do you have to support your efforts and your program? What data do you need? Because again, it's when you have those evidence-based approaches and objectives that you're going to secure that funding and the support to actually carry that forward into your community. So when we giving and where the money comes from and where it actually is being given to, I often go to this source. It's Giving USA, and so in America in 2019, Americans gave almost $450 billion to charity. Now that's a very big number, and this includes education institutions, public and societal benefit organizations, environmental efforts, animals and arts, culture and humanities. All of these organizations actually and sectors saw double-digit growth in 2019. So where did all that money go? About 29% of it actually went to religious organizations, and that was an increase over the previous year. 14% went to education, while 12% went to human services, 12% to foundations, about 9% to health. And that's where we are. That's the sector that most of our organizations reside in. 8% to public society benefit, 6% to international affairs, 5% to arts, culture, and humanities, 3% to environment and animals, and 2% to individuals. So I think this is important, and again, you could probably find the same source for your own country of where those charitable dollars go, because then that gives you a better understanding of what the potential income and revenue that could be generated. Interestingly enough, 69% of the giving that happens comes from individuals. Only 17% come from foundations. And in the US, 10% come by giving bequests, so planned giving and estate giving, and then 5% by corporations. So oftentimes, again, this is a little bit out of sync because people think, oh, well, it's large corporations or it's large foundations that are supporting nonprofits. When in reality, the numbers don't lie, and they show that it's individuals that are donating to causes that they most want to support that really is the key. Again, in the US, we have been fortunate in that we've seen that continued growth in individual giving and foundation giving over the last several years. Now, how that will pan out for 2020 is still yet to be seen. But fund development is a process. And remember, we've already done a webinar on this that goes in vast detail around fundraising fundamentals. But it's all about cultivation. Recognizing the individuals that have the ability, the interest, and the link to your organization to support. So they have to have that disposable income that they're willing to give. They have to have an interest in your mission, your work, your cause in order to move that forward. And then they have to have a link to that. Oftentimes, remember, people give to people they know. People give to people they like. And so it's cultivating those relationships that's vitally important. It's also about solicitation. And as we've talked about before, asking. If you don't ask, you don't get. So you have to actually ask for that donation. Fund development is also about stewardship. So once you receive those funds, how are you a good steward of those funds? Do you report back to your donors how those funds were utilized and the impact that they made on the community? And then it's about that continuous diversification of revenue streams, not putting all of your eggs into one basket, because we know that some funder can be here today and gone tomorrow. So you can't be far too dependent on any one source of revenue. The next key aspect to building a strong organization, a strong nonprofit, is surrounding yourself with good people and building a strong team. That often begins with defining what your desired culture will be. Knowing the kind of organization you want to build, the values that are important to you as the leader, and that will be important to the rest of your team. At Allergy and Asthma Network, we have 3 values: respect, responsibility, and relationship. And these define and shape every single interaction that we have, not only with external stakeholders, but also among our own staff, our board, and internal stakeholders. And don't forget how important diversification is. Everyone shouldn't look exactly like you as the founder of a nonprofit. It's important to have diversity and inclusion to make sure that you've got different points of view and perspectives, and that people are coming from different walks of life to help you build a more balanced, effective organization. This, again, is vitally important when you start talking about your board of directors. Some organizations only have patients on their board of directors. So make sure that if that is the case, that you have patients that come from various backgrounds and from various different geographic regions that you're representing. So they should have different cultures, different socioeconomic, certainly different racial diversity, but also job and function. We at our board at Allergy and Asthma Network, we take a look every year at who's moving off, who's moving on, what are the gaps, what are the needs, is it in finance and accounting, is it in legal understanding, is it in fund development, is it in organizational development and capacity building? What are the needs that we have as an organization? And then how can we recruit someone on the board that's going to help carry us forward and fulfill the needs of development that we have as an organization. And then staff. When we're talking about, the people that are the closest to you, that are in the trenches every day carrying the mission forward. I can't say enough importance about making sure that those people are aligned on culture, but also build diversification. Our staff at the network is only 10 people, but we have ages ranging from 30 years old to 65. We have 4 different ethnicities. We have, men and women. We definitely have a very diverse group for such a small staff. And I'm proud of that because I think that it makes us stronger and it absolutely helps us to better understand the patient community that we support. And then as you're building your volunteer team, again, look for people who not only have that heart and that willingness, that desire to help, but have the capacity, have the ability, have some strengths and experiences that are going to help you carry the organization into the next phase of growth. Next comes, how do we evaluate and measure our impact? We have to start out by defining what success looks like from the very outset. And this is done on many different levels. First, at the program level, what is the reach of that program? What is the impact? Again, having that spreadsheet that we talked about of what are the inputs, what are the outputs? How do we make sure that we've got a budget and we know what is going to drive impact and evaluation as we conduct those programs? Secondly, organization impact. This, to me, we have different metrics in our dashboard around board participation and retention, staff turnover, staff engagement, staff performance, as well as financial dashboards and how well we're meeting our budget and achieving our objectives there. There are many different organizational metrics that you can evaluate, what we call key performance indicators, to determine how you're advancing and moving the mission forward. But if it's not measured, it really isn't getting done. And so this is something that is a discipline and is not easy when you're starting up a new nonprofit or when you're growing a nonprofit. But to take the time and do this well really is what's going to continue to propel your organization and your mission forward. And then measuring the impact on a broader scale at that societal level. How are you impacting mortality rates, morbidity rates, quality of life, healthcare utilization? Are you designing programs and initiatives that are truly getting to the greatest need and impacting for the greatest good? Next, we're going to talk about some of the myths that come about when working and actually bust some of those myths, because these are things that sometimes get confusing. And sometimes as a nonprofit leader, you're like, should we be earning a profit? Can we lobby? So we're going to talk about some of these as we talk about continuing to grow a thriving nonprofit. So first off, nonprofits can't earn a profit. The reality is that the term nonprofit really is a little bit of a misnomer. Nonprofits can absolutely make a profit. And in fact, you should always try to have some positive revenue to build that reserve fund. That's the only way that you're going to ensure sustainability of your organization. But the key difference between nonprofits and for-profits is that a nonprofit organization does not distribute its profits to any private individual. So although nonprofits may pay reasonable compensation to employees, it's not as if it's any one individual's personal gain. That prohibition against private benefit and gain is what causes that tax-exempt charitable nonprofit to be formed to benefit the public and not the private interest of an individual. The second myth is that a well-run nonprofit should have low overhead costs. The reality is operating costs like paying utility bills, rent, salaries, investing in office equipment, all of these things are called a lot of different things. But at the end of the day, it's an overhead, administrative cost, or indirect cost. And while that terminology may vary, one thing doesn't vary. These costs are essential to delivering your nonprofit's mission, and they have no relation to the level of effectiveness or to the outcomes that a charitable nonprofit can deliver. So it's important to manage those overhead costs and to know your costs and to also communicate those costs to funders. But at the end of the day, if your nonprofit requires higher overhead costs to deliver your services, then you should show your supporters how that core infrastructure is essential to advancing your mission. Next, nonprofits don't have paid staff. They only use volunteers. This is something that I've heard time and time again, and I've actually had heated debates with different people about. Because according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US, nonprofits actually employ about 12 million people. And that's over 10% of private employment here in our country. And so this is an important sector that does support the economy and should be viewed as such. There is no reason why, if you are giving your time, skills, experience, and knowledge, that you should not be paid to do the work of a nonprofit. The fourth myth, nonprofits can't lobby. Now, I'm going to tell you this is very specific to your own country and to the legal requirements of a nonprofit or a charitable organization. But in the US, every charitable nonprofit can and should make its voice heard on issues that are important to its mission and to the people or the cause that it serves. As advocates, nonprofits are often required to speak up about policies, laws, and regulations. And lobbying by nonprofits is actually permitted by law in the US. However, tax-exempt nonprofit organizations are not permitted to engage in political activity, like supporting or opposing any specific candidate for office. And the amount of lobbying that a nonprofit can do is limited to a certain percentage of your overall work here in the US. But again, that's something that you should check in your own individual country about your ability to advocate and educate with policymakers. Next, nonprofits get most of their funding from foundations. As we've already seen in the slide that showed the Giving USA, foundations definitely represent an important part, but it's really only a small part of the total dollars contributed each year to the nonprofit community. Private philanthropy that often includes both donations from individuals and grants from private or corporate foundations only represent about 12% of the total annual revenue. And most, as I said before, most of the income and the contributions for nonprofits come from individuals. So remember that. Sometimes we get caught up on, corporate giving and foundations and, other key areas of revenue. But oftentimes it's those government grants that are the foundation for the work we do, or the fee-for-service grants, those sponsorship agreements and things like that are vital to ensuring we have the resources needed to carry out our mission. Next myth, charitable giving incentives only benefit the wealthy and elite. The truth is that all charitable nonprofits actually benefit from public support and donations, and most depend on private donations to actively serve their community. So while an individual taxpayer only receives a partial tax benefit for their charitable donations, the community that's served by that receives the full value of every dollar. And any cap that's on giving incentives negatively affects the overall community. So there are some charitable giving incentives, and I have a document that I can put in the resource guide that you can follow up on what are some of those charitable giving incentives, tax benefits, again, and some of this is going to be very country specific. But here in the United States, if you itemize your deductions, then you can deduct your charitable contributions. Final myth, most nonprofits are large with many resources. The reality is most nonprofits are not large. They are very small in both budget size and number of employees. And while there are some large, well-known nonprofits, especially in the U.S., like the Red Cross or the American Cancer Society, those nonprofits have a lot of visibility, but they are not representative of the community as a whole. In fact, it's greater than 80% of all public charities have an annual revenue less than $1 million. So most nonprofit organizations have small budgets of less than $1 million a year and are not these large mammoth organizations with tons of people or tons of resources. So in these last few minutes, I want to share a little bit about what I call the nonprofit life cycle. So even if you are not at this growth stage of starting a nonprofit, no matter where you are, there are different factors that you should really consider in where you're at in the life cycle of your nonprofit. So if you're at that idea or startup phase, remember it may be more informal. You may have to establish your need. You may have to begin to determine what are the best practices and actually begin integrating sort of pilot programs and thinking about what are the pilot programs that you can gain some traction to then advance and move forward. In that initial idea stage, is this dream possible? There are obstacles like resistance to forming, lack of funding, not having outside support, but there's also opportunities. And those opportunities oftentimes are the energy and the creativity you have around your dream, the passion that you have for your cause, and the excitement of other people to join in. So thinking about what the challenges are, but also what the opportunities are in each stage can help to keep you moving forward. This chart really goes through the impact, the governance, the culture and operations, the revenue, and the brand at each of these phases of the life cycle. And it also gives you indications and times where you could stop and pause and think, what do we need to do to not go into a decline? How do we turn this around and keep moving forward? In that startup phase, which usually is around that first year or two that you've got a new nonprofit, the obstacles can include kind of the fear of becoming formal and official, certainly that sustaining of the initial enthusiasm and the passion that got you underway, and then focusing the energy of the founder and that early staff is always a challenge in the early days. Some of the opportunities can be identifying new funders and having a charismatic leader that people definitely want to be around, want to be a part of what they're growing and doing to make an impact in the community. And having that volunteer community that wants to belong, that wants to be involved, and is right there with you in those startup phases of early days of a new nonprofit. As you go into the growth phase, it's how do we build this to actually be viable? Oftentimes this is around the 3 to 5 year mark. And sometimes you face different obstacles like the absence of systems or accountability. Sometimes you feel overwhelmed with the degree of change that's going on in this growth time. You're trying to build your board, expand that board, have more diversity and more focus on planning and oversight. And that can be challenging. And it may change as the organization changes. It may change the funders. It may change the clients, the staff, and even the board composition. And sometimes in this growth phase, you actually have the danger of sort of becoming isolated. And in that system of growing in that focused era, that opportunities may be difficult to always see. So in that growth period, it's that sense of accomplishment. It's the new faces, arms, legs, and feet that are moving the mission forward. It's certainly the diversification into new projects and programs and areas of the organization. And it's also oftentimes about rejuvenation for the founder. It's finding that next level. I often say that, in my 8 years at the network, I've had to give up to go up. I've had to give up what I thought the role was going to be in the first 2 or 3 years to go up to the next level and to take chances and seek new opportunities to keep us growing and maturing. In that mature stage, in that maturity stage, it's all about sustainability. That lack of control or too much control can also be an obstacle at this phase. Sometimes you're adverse to taking risk, and sometimes you become too operational in this maturity phase. I came into an organization that had a president and founder for 28 years, and I would say that that's where they were at the time that I came in. Sometimes it was very difficult to transition the board and the staff, and to there was this sometimes healthy and sometimes unhealthy conflict between the old and the new. So we had to look for opportunities. How do we feel secure and yet continue to push the envelope? How do we try something new and stay fresh and relevant to the community that we're serving, and still serve our base and build adequate resources to do all of that? How do we bring in new staff and new board members for fresh ideas? These are all things in that maturity phase that are really critically important to making sure that you don't head towards the decline or stagnation phase. In that phase, unfortunately, it's how, if at all, can we renew? Oftentimes you see kind of this resistance to change, the inability to adapt and to address the challenges that arise. Oftentimes it's kind of a declining excitement in the leadership and the board. And sometimes it's even isolation of that agency or that nonprofit organization. The thing that is an opportunity in this decline phase, I think, is really thinking about what you've built to date. How do you build off of those strategic partnerships? How do you learn from your past successes, the wisdom that is there, but also take risk and step out in faith, and to begin to think out of the box rather than in the defined success that you've had to date. And then the final point of the nonprofit life cycle is decline and shutdown, or what we call crisis mode. And this is, oftentimes, unfortunately, we're seeing this now. We talked about it in the COVID crisis management webinar. Sometimes when we have financial crisis or leadership crisis or loss of staff and volunteers, or just our passion is gone, then it's really time to consider shutting the organization down or moving on. I think that, as I said in the crisis management, anytime there is a crisis, there's also opportunity. So you have to have that full-on commitment to turn around the organization. You also have to sometimes have crucial conversations about, is it time to merge? Is it time to ask someone to step away? Is there a graceful way to exit? And I think that, it's definitely a challenging time. And at Allergy and Asthma Network, we went through that when we had the transition with leadership, where it was a struggle, and the board really had to have some of those crucial conversations in order to make sure that the organization could continue not only to exist, but to thrive. And I, for one, am very grateful that they did. So in summary, we've talked about, what it means to start a nonprofit with the legal structure, the mission and the purpose, the business model and the funding plan, building a strong team, and measuring the impact. We also have addressed some of the myths around nonprofits and what it means to be a successful, growing nonprofit. And then finally, we spent a few minutes looking at that nonprofit life cycle, and hopefully in all that this has given you guys a great overview of how to start a nonprofit, how to continue to grow a nonprofit, and to keep reinventing yourself in order to better serve the community that you represent. At this time, we'll take questions and answers, and thank you for your time and attention today.